On January 3, 2020, a United States drone strike killed Qasem Soleimani, the most powerful military figure in Iran, commander of the Quds Force, the man who had built Iran's network of proxy militias across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen into the most sophisticated non-state military apparatus in the modern Middle East. Donald Trump ordered the strike, called it a defensive action. The world held its breath, waiting for escalation, for war. What followed was measured. Iran fired missiles at American bases in Iraq, gave advance warning so casualties could be minimized, and then stood down. No war, because Iran had bigger problems than revenge. Its economy was collapsing. Its currency had lost 60% of its value in 2 years. Inflation was running above 40%, and its oil, the resource that should have been funding everything, had been almost completely cut off from global markets by American sanctions. So where was it going? The country that built an empire on oil. Iran has been producing oil since 1908, when William Knox Darcy, a British entrepreneur, struck oil at Masjid Suleiman in southwestern Iran. It was the first major oil discovery in the Middle East, and it set in motion a chain of events that would shape global politics for the next century. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later renamed British Petroleum, extracted Iranian oil for decades on terms that left Iran with a fraction of the revenues. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, nationalized the oil industry. The British organized a global boycott of Iranian oil, and in 1953, with American CIA assistance, Mossadegh was overthrown in a coup. The Shah was restored to power. Western oil companies returned. Iran's oil flowed again east to London and New York, on terms set in Washington, for 26 years until 1979, the revolution that changed everything. In February 1979, the Islamic Revolution swept the Shah from power. Ayatollah Khamenei returned from exile in Paris, and Iran became something the world had never seen before, a theocratic republic, hostile to both American capitalism and Soviet communism. The oil was nationalized again. The National Iranian Oil Company, NIOC, took control, and the revenues, instead of flowing to Western shareholders, began funding the revolutionary government, funding the war with Iraq, which Saddam Hussein launched in 1980, and which consumed 8 years and 1 million lives, funding Iran's regional ambitions, funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq and Syria, and funding the development of a nuclear program that would eventually bring the full weight of American economic power down on Iranian oil exports, the sanctions architecture. Understanding where Iran's oil has gone requires understanding how American sanctions actually work, because they are not simply a trade embargo. They are a global financial weapon. The key mechanism is dollar clearing. Almost all international oil transactions are denominated in US dollars, which means they must at some point pass through the American banking system, which means the United States can block them. Any bank, anywhere in the world, that processes a payment for Iranian oil risks being cut off from the American financial system. This is how American sanctions achieve global reach, without requiring global agreement. The Europeans may disagree with the sanctions, the Chinese may resent them, the Indians may find them inconvenient, but their banks, if they want access to the dollar system, must comply. This is the most important thing to understand about Iranian oil. It didn't disappear. It just had to find new routes, new buyers, new methods, and new ways to get paid. That didn't touch the American banking system, the nuclear deal, and its collapse. The most consequential sanctions came in 2 waves, the first under President Obama, following the revelation of Iran's covert nuclear enrichment program. The 2012 sanctions cut Iran off from the SWIFT international banking system. Iran's oil production, which had been around 3.5 million barrels per day, fell to under 1 million. The economy contracted sharply, inflation surged, the rial collapsed. Iran came to the negotiating table. And in 2015, the nuclear deal was signed, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program. In exchange, sanctions were lifted. Oil exports recovered toward 2.5 million barrels per day. The economy stabilized for 3 years until Donald Trump. Maximum pressure. In May 2018, Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the nuclear deal, called it the worst deal ever negotiated, and reimposed sanctions with a new doctrine, maximum pressure. The goal, stated explicitly by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, was to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero, to strangle the Iranian economy. until Iran agreed to a new deal, on American terms. The pressure was real. Iranian oil exports fell from 2.5 million barrels per day to as low as 300,000 barrels per day by 2019. The rial lost 60% of its value. Inflation hit 40%. Ordinary Iranians, who had nothing to do with the nuclear program, faced shortages of medicine, food, and basic goods. The maximum pressure campaign achieved one thing. It caused enormous suffering. What it did not achieve was a new deal. Iran refused to negotiate under sanctions, accelerated its uranium enrichment, and found other ways to sell its oil. The Shadow Fleet. This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. When conventional oil markets were closed to Iran, Iran built an entirely parallel system, a shadow fleet, tankers operating outside the normal tracking systems, ships that turned off their AIS transponders, the automatic identification systems that broadcast a vessel's location, and sailed in the dark, transferring oil at sea deep to disguise the origin, falsifying documents using shell companies registered in multiple jurisdictions to obscure the ownership chain. The sophistication of this operation is remarkable. At its peak, Iran was operating hundreds of vessels in a coordinated global sanctions evasion network. The oil moved primarily in one direction, east, toward China, the buyer of last resort. China became the primary destination for Iranian oil under sanctions, not because China officially supports Iran's nuclear program, not because Beijing and Tehran are formal allies, but because Chinese refineries, particularly the smaller independent refineries known as teapot refineries, were willing to buy Iranian crude at a significant discount to market price. The discount was the point. Iranian oil under sanctions sold for $10 to $20 per barrel below market price. For Chinese refineries, that discount made the sanctions risk worth taking, especially since China's state-owned banks, increasingly operating outside the dollar system, could process payments in yuan through channels that American regulators couldn't easily reach. By 2023, Iran was exporting an estimated 1.5 to 1.8 million barrels per day, mostly to China, despite the sanctions, despite maximum pressure, despite every American effort to reduce exports to zero. The oil didn't stop flowing. It just stopped flowing through channels Washington could see, where the money goes. But here is where the story becomes darker. Because even when Iran successfully sells its oil, the money doesn't necessarily reach ordinary Iranians. The sanctions create enormous friction in the financial system. Iranian oil revenues, even when successfully collected, are often trapped in foreign accounts, in China, in Iraq, in other jurisdictions, because transferring money back to Iran through the banking system remains extremely difficult. The Iranian government has access to the oil revenue in principle. Getting it into Iran, in a usable form, is another matter. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, have built their own parallel economic empire, controlling significant portions of the sanctions evasion network, the shadow fleet, the front companies, the intermediaries, skimming revenues at every step. The IRGC is not just a military force, it is a business conglomerate, operating in construction, telecommunications, oil, and trade, with estimated revenues in the tens of billions per year. Much of it derived from sanctions evasion. The sanctions were supposed to pressure the Iranian government. They pressured ordinary Iranians. The Revolutionary Guards, who control the mechanisms of evasion, adapted and profited, the people who lost, were the ones who couldn't afford shadow fleets, or front companies, or foreign bank accounts. The 2025 war and its consequences. In 2025, following months of escalating tensions, the United States launched military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. The strikes the most significant military action against Iran in the history of the bilateral relationship, targeted enrichment sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The immediate military impact was significant. Iran's nuclear program was set back by an estimated several years, but the economic consequences were were felt immediately. Global oil prices spiked as markets priced in supply disruption. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes, became a flashpoint. Iran threatened to close it. The United States deployed additional naval assets. For weeks, the most important shipping lane in the world existed under the shadow of potential military confrontation. The shadow fleet was disrupted. Chinese refineries pulled back from Iranian purchases, at least temporarily, as the risk calculus changed. Iranian oil exports fell sharply. And the Iranian economy, already under severe strain, faced the additional pressure of a country that had just been bombed, trying to maintain oil exports through a sanctions regime and a compromised nuclear deterrent simultaneously. The Khamenei calculation. At the center of all of this is one man, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. In power since 1989, the man who makes the final decisions on the nuclear program, on the sanctions response, on the shadow fleet, on the proxy network, on everything that matters in Iran. Khamenei's calculation has been remarkably consistent across more than 3 decades. The Islamic Republic will not surrender its nuclear program, will not normalize relations with the United States, will not abandon its regional proxy strategy, because doing so would undermine the ideological foundations of the revolution itself. Better to endure sanctions, better to see ordinary Iranians suffer, than to make concessions that would signal weakness and potentially unravel the regime's legitimacy. This is not madness. It is a coherent, if brutal, strategic calculation. Regimes that have surrendered their nuclear programs, Libya under Gaddafi, Ukraine after the Soviet collapse, have not fared well. The lesson Khamenei has drawn is that the nuclear program is the only thing that truly deters regime change. And so the oil revenues, whatever reaches Tehran, go first, to maintaining the IRGC, maintaining the proxy network, maintaining the nuclear program, and maintaining the security apparatus. That keeps Khamenei in power. Ordinary Iranians get what's left. The parallel economy. What has emerged in Iran is something genuinely unusual in modern economic history. A parallel economy, built entirely around sanctions evasion, that is now so sophisticated, so embedded, so profitable for those who run it, that it has become an end in itself. The shadow fleet operators, the front company networks, the cryptocurrency channels, increasingly used to transfer value outside the dollar system. The barter arrangements, trading oil for Chinese manufactured goods, bypassing currency conversion entirely. This parallel economy has created a class of Iranians connected to the IRGC and the regime who have profited enormously from sanctions. The worse the sanctions, the more valuable their services. The harder Washington pushes, the richer the sanctions evaders become. It is one of the great unintended consequences of the maximum pressure doctrine. By making conventional trade impossible, the sanctions created an enormous market for unconventional trade, and the people best positioned to service that market were the ones closest to the regime. So where has Iran's oil gone? Into Chinese refineries, purchased at a discount through shadow tankers, paid for in yuan through channels Washington cannot easily monitor, into the accounts of IRGC-connected intermediaries who take their cut at every step of the evasion chain, into the funding of Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias, the proxy network that is Iran's primary strategic asset, into the nuclear program, whose continuation is Khamenei's non-negotiable red line, and into the foreign accounts, where Iranian oil revenues sit trapped, unable to enter Iran through the conventional banking system, accumulating while the Iranian people, who produce the oil, wait for a system that can deliver what belongs to them. Trump wanted to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero. He didn't. Khamenei wanted the oil to fund Iran's revolutionary project. It does, but at an enormous cost. In economic suffering that falls on people who had no vote, in either man's decisions. The oil didn't disappear. It found a way. It always does. The question is only, who benefits from the path it takes? And in Iran's case, as in Venezuela's, as in Libya's, the answer is almost never. The people who live above it. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. The answers are in history, and I will show you where to look.